The emperor wrote on this occasion to the empress the following letter, which was intended for publication in the Moniteur. Madame and very dear wife, I send you 20 flags taken by our armies at the battles of Wachau, Leipzig, and Hanau. It is an homage which I am pleased to render you. I wish you to consider it as a proof of my great satisfaction with your conduct during the regency which I entrusted to you. This letter having no other purpose, I pray God that he may have you in his holy and worthy keeping. Signed, Napoleon. Given at Frankfurt, November 1st, 1813. These trophies were a very poor compensation for the losses experienced by our armies in this disastrous campaign. But they threw a last luster on our arms, which fortune, if not glory, was preparing to abandon. The emperor followed the letter which I have just quoted very closely. He arrived at Mayence on the morrow, and the remnants of the army crossed the Rhine here. He only remained the time necessary to make the first arrangements for the defense of our frontiers, which were menaced by the coalition and by the entire forces of Germany, which only shortly before had been assembled under the French flag. After having given the most urgent orders for the reorganization of the army, Napoleon left for St. Cloud and arrived there on November 9th. The pleasure of seeing his wife and son again was balm upon Napoleon's wounds, and it was only a momentary diversion from all the cares with which he was besieged. Every moment of his time was taken up by the necessity of providing for the defense of the territory. Councils of administration presided over by the emperor were held every hour in the day. Extraordinary efforts were made to recruit the army, to remount the artillery, manufacture arms, and so on. The treasure which had been amassed during 10 years in the cellars of the Tuileries was employed to meet this extraordinary expense. This treasure was the product of 14 million francs, annual savings realized on the funds of the civil list, a circumstance which had not prevented the imperial court from being the most splendid in Europe. Such was the result of a well-regulated administration free from abuses. On his return to Paris, the emperor heard of the capitulation of Marshal Saint-Cyr's corps, which he had left in Dresden. By the terms of this capitulation, these troops were to re-enter France, with the engagement taken in their name not to serve against the Allies during a period which was fixed. The General-in-Chief, Schwarzenberg, refused to ratify this clause, making Marshal Saint-Cyr the ridiculous offer to return to Dresden, where the French army, placed as it was at the moment of the capitulation, would be at liberty to recommence the struggle. In consequence, the Marshal remained a prisoner of war with his army corps. This sad example of a violation of plighted faith given by the Austrian General-in-Chief was followed by the Allied sovereigns with regard to the Danzig garrison. The Allied forces refused to ratify the capitulation, which granted the return to France of General Rapp and the French garrison. These honorable victims of the bad faith of our enemies were shut up in the prison at Kiev. The Allies also violated the engagements which had been stipulated by them with regard to our garrisons at the time of the capitulation of Wittenberg and Torgau. The other forts, which were still occupied in Germany, fell one after the other into the hands of the enemy. The French garrisons, which we had left there, would have sufficed to compose a large army. News from Spain was no better. The Spaniards, who had placed the command of their forces in the hands of Lord Wellington, were now no longer fighting for their freedom. They were threatening the territory of France. The emperor had resigned himself to conclude a treaty with Ferdinand, who had remained a prisoner at Valençay, dated December 11th, 1813, a treaty which sent back to the Spaniards a master who was to avenge the French conqueror. By this treaty, Napoleon acknowledged Ferdinand as King of Spain and of the Indies, and undertook to withdraw the French troops from the Spanish territory. The king and his side promised to make the English troops evacuate Spain. Prisoners on both sides were to be exchanged. Amongst other stipulations, the King of Spain undertook to pay his father, King Charles IV, and the Queen an annual pension of 30 million of reals, 7.5 million francs. I must not omit to relate, because it is another trait of Ferdinand's character, that whilst this prince was signing the treaty which he had no intention of carrying out, he renewed his request to obtain one of the emperor's nieces in marriage, the lady whom he asked for being one of King Joseph's daughters. Marshal Suchet was commissioned to receive King Joseph and the princes of his family on their return from Spain. He had maintained himself in the provinces in the east with brilliant success for a long time. This marshal was in occupation of Valenciennes when he received the news of the defeat of Vittoria and the order to approach the frontiers without abandoning the principal forts, which he left in a good state of defense and provided with garrisons whose total amounted to 20,000 men. The retreat of the French had begun on July 5th. Marshal Suchet, who had become Duke of Albufeira, as a reward for his splendid services, set up his cantonments in the neighborhood of Barcelona after having rallied the army in Aragon. He handed over the forts in Aragon to Catalonia to Ferdinand, who undertook by a written covenant to return the French garrisons, who might still be there at the earliest possible opportunity. But he did not keep this promise. The violation of his promises and the non-execution of the clause of the Valenciennes Treaty left Marshal Suchet no other alternative than to recross the Pyrenees. King Joseph, whom we left reestablished in his capital, not having been able to maintain himself there, was forced to think of leaving Madrid. The French army in the peninsula had further been weakened by the loss of 12,000 men who had received orders to return to France. The disasters which our soldiers had encountered in Russia, published in the fatal 29th Bulletin, hastened on the evacuation of Madrid, which this time became definite. Joseph proceeded to Valladolid and Burgos, where he remained for some days on the defensive with an army of about 30,000 men, escorting long columns of equipage of every kind, and the baggage of more than 2,000 Spanish families who were following the fortunes of Napoleon's brother. The operations of the enemy's general obliged King Joseph to fall back upon Vittoria. A part of the convoy was sent in the direction of Tolosa, attacked on the June 21st before Vittoria by hostile forces 3 times superior in numbers coming from the left and from the right. King Joseph's army was completely routed without General Clausel's corps being able to rejoin him. This disastrous day settled the fate of Spain when, however, the loss in men was not as great as was to be feared from the obstruction, which hampered the movement of the French army. This loss consisted of about 5,000 men killed, wounded, or prisoners. The enemy lost about as many, but all our war material fell into their hands. The French left a garrison of 4,000 men in Pamplona, and the remnants of our army withdrew to Bayonne. Joseph cast off his empty title of king and went to seek in his fatherland rest, if not oblivion, after a life so alien to the gentleness of his manners and character. It became necessary to bestow on the army in Spain a leader able to unite its debris and check the progress of the enemy. The Emperor sent off Marshal Soult, invested with the chief command at full speed. The Anglo-Spanish armies could not be checked in their march from the Pyrenees, and Marshal Soult, after having disputed the ground inch by inch, was forced to draw back to Bayonne, where the victorious army of the enemy followed him. The Battle of Toulouse was violently contested, and both armies experienced heavy losses. It remained without any useful result and was the last act of this great drama. Thus ended the important expedition to Spain, where, as in the memorable Russian campaign, the bravest soldiers in the world, commanded by generals educated in a great school and guided by the most illustrious captain of ancient and modern times, ended in immortal struggles, a career of 20 years of glory. These struggles will not be sterile. These bands of veterans nobly fulfilled their task, marching victoriously through Egypt and the capitals of the continent, from the icy regions of the north down to the pillars of Hercules. They scattered broadcast on their way the seeds of civilization, of generous and valiant ideas, which will surely bear their fruits. They displayed a heroism and military virtues which will serve as an example and as a lesson to those who shall come after us. The emperor's brothers were assembled in Paris, with the exception of Lucien, who remained in Rome and did not return to Napoleon until 1815. King Joseph, after the Anglo-Spanish armies had crossed the Pyrenees, had returned to the fatherland, which he had only quitted to act in conformity with the desires and views of his powerful brother. The King of Westphalia, Jerome, forced by the insurrection in Germany and by our enemies to abandon his kingdom, had sought refuge in France with Queen Catherine. The violation of Swiss territory by the Allies did not allow the former King Louis of Holland to prolong his stay there. He arrived in Paris on January 1st, 1814, and was coldly received by the emperor. But he found assistance and protection in France. Still anxious to recover the throne of Holland, he had made a fresh application with this in view to the emperor in the month of March 1813 and towards the end of September to the authorities in Amsterdam. But Holland was waiting for the Allies to lay down the law. The reestablishment of the House of Nassau having destroyed all King Louis's hopes, he resigned himself to forget them and thought nothing more than to live in retirement. He was in a deplorable state of health, nearly crippled in all his members, no remedy having been able to check the progress of his disease. King Louis came to Paris with a hope of being able to go and live on his estate at St. Lô, but followed the Empress on her departure from Paris to Blois. When the Bourbons had returned to Paris, he took leave of the Empress and of her son and returned to Switzerland, whence he afterwards proceeded to Rome. King Joseph also took refuge in Switzerland and lived there very quietly until the emperor's return from the island of Elba. The King of Westphalia returned with his king to the states of the King of Württemberg, his father-in-law, who treated him like a proscript. He was at Trieste and preparing to make his way to Rome when the events of March 1815 recalled him to Paris. The state of religious affairs and the absence of the sovereign pontiff from Rome caused an irritation which was to be removed by the return of the Pope to Rome. Pourparlers with this object in view were held at Fontainebleau. This negotiation was entrusted to Countess Brignole, lady-in-waiting to the Empress and mother of the ambassador of Sardinia to Paris under the Restoration. She is the only woman ever employed by the emperor in diplomatic negotiations. It is necessary to add that the friendship which bound this lady to Cardinal Consalvi and her relations in Rome, where one of her sons was a prelate, decided the emperor in his choice, as much as her personal qualities. In short, every effort calculated to remedy our evils or to increase our resources was tried. In the meanwhile, however, the Allied powers were intoxicated with the success they had gained. They worked Napoleon's pride and misfortunes to their advantage and seemed to sport with his agony. They stirred up the hotbeds of Jacobinism, of national prejudices, of fanaticism, to inflame with their sparks the passions of the people of Germany against the man who had extinguished the hatreds and furies of the French Revolution. They blindly hurried on the destruction of the sovereign who had saved the royal houses from the effects of a revolutionary propaganda and who reassured the thrones by the establishment in France of a political state which resembled the forms of European governments. Napoleon might have appealed against them by calling out a mass levy of the nation if the great corporations of the state, joining their voices to that of the emperor in one patriotic thought, had sanctioned this appeal to the nation. France might still have been saved, but to reduce himself to play the part of an adventurer, to put his glory into the lists with evil passions, to resuscitate by illegal and disturbing measures the factions and the anarchy which he had destroyed, to organize It might be a civil war. These things Napoleon was not willing to do. He sacrificed to the fear of such great calamities his crown and the future of his son and his family. He did not wish to appear in the eyes of posterity as a mere vulgar, ambitious man, and the French people, rejecting the vulgar accusation which has been made against Napoleon by the utopians of having been the enemy of public liberties, has done him justice. Lying words of peace, dictated by a false semblance of moderation, were transmitted from Frankfurt by Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, who had been detained prisoner at Weimar, where he occupied the post of French ambassador, whilst the ambassadors of Austria, Russia, and England, with whom Monsieur de Saint-Aignan had been put into communication, were appearing desirous of opening out negotiations, the enemy's generals deciding on the plan of an invasion of France. It suited the Allies to show themselves under a pacific exterior so as to better dupe the French nation and to isolate Napoleon by pointing him out as a man whose personal ambition was the only obstacle to complete pacification. The emperor had, however, caused Monsieur de Saint-Aignan proposals to be answered to the effect that he consented to the proposed conditions: France to be limited to her natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees; Spain to be restored to her former dynasty; Italy, Germany, and Holland to be reestablished in their independence. Napoleon proposed the meeting of a congress at Mannheim to treat on this basis. The Austrian ambassador answered that the two emperors and the King of Prussia had been pleased with his consent to their proposals, that they transmitted them to the co-allies, and they accepted the selection of the town of Mannheim. And whilst the allies allowed the Austrian ambassador to dupe Napoleon with the hope of a pacification, which was very far from their intentions, they published the Declaration of Frankfurt of December 1st, in which they made it public that they were not making war on France, but on the emperor alone, and the preponderance which he had too long exercised beyond the limits of his empire. They protested the most liberal intentions towards France, which they desired to see remain great, strong, and happy, assurances which were as sincere as were their overtures of peace. This was to be seen very soon, when our enemies had accomplished the resolution about which they had hesitated of crossing our frontiers. In spite of Monsieur de Metternich's fine promises, the Duc de Vison's Caulaincourt, who was waiting at the outposts for them to be carried into effect, could not succeed to be admitted to negotiate for peace. And hostilities, which had not been interrupted, were pushed on with new vigor.